Hello, everybody. Let me know about audio as always, because I'm not good at this kind of stuff. But it's great to be back. I have been away the last month or so. Well, a touch more than a month. And you might be thinking to yourselves, what's been going on? And those of you who follow me on Twitter, you all know exactly what's been going on. Over the last month, as of May 5th, my son was born. And so I took the month off while he was being. We're getting used to having a little kid to take care of. And now that we're getting back into the groove, we're getting ready to go. So now we're going to do some Q&As. We're going to discuss the election aftermath and stuff like that. And I'm going to be discussing my channel. I'm probably going to be tweaking the upload schedule, which I'll discuss more as more people show up on the live stream. I'm just going to wait a moment on that. But while we're waiting for more people to show up, I, as a new father, cannot... Oops. This did not... Oh. That did not work. Okay. Apparently, these images do not grow very nicely. There we go. There's the little guy. That's what he looks like. That's my little son. Isn't that neat? Isn't that neat? So, now that that's out of the way, we're going to start off with, before I get into Q&As, before I get into channel updates, I'm going to get into election aftermath. So, the election, as of now, has been about a month ago. It was on April 28th, and Carney won. Now, those of you who follow me on Twitter will notice that I had a projection update after the last projection. In other words, after my last video, I updated the projections once more. So, I will be doing a more comprehensive breakdown of my results versus other people, versus the actual data and all that kind of stuff. But just for those YouTube-only viewers, which is perfectly fine. There's no reason why you can't just be a YouTube viewer. But sometimes I am not a very... I'm a forgetful person. And I forget to update or post posts on YouTube. I might sometimes only post them on Twitter. So I'll just be capturing here. Which one is it? Is this going to cause recursion? Let's see. That caused recursion. Okay, we don't want that. Is it this one? No. Aha. It's been a while. I'm a little out of practice. Here we go. So this is my... This was the final forecast I published. So, as you can see, this was pretty good. I'm not going to go and go too in-depth as of this moment on going through these results and going through where I went wrong, where I went right, and all that kind of stuff. That's going to come later. I'm hoping Monday, but we will see if I have time to record the video by Monday. But with this, let us get into the main meat and potatoes here. So the election was simultaneously completely expected and completely unexpected. By the time it happened, it was pretty clear by the polling that without a major polling miss, the Liberals were going to win. But there was a big question of the margins and the degrees. A lot of the Liberal internal forecasts and numbers and discussions suggested that they could be somewhere in the north of 180 to 190, some even suggested 200 seats for the Liberal internals. Others had the Conservatives doing a lot better than they actually did. And all of these things just turned out to be wrong. And I think a corollary to this is because a lot of these campaign staff and a lot of these decision makers, a lot of these advisors turned out to be wrong, quite notably, quite systemically wrong on the matter of how many seats that were going to happen in the election. Much, much worse than people like myself or Fournier or Polywave, if you know that site as well. That you kind of get this weird sense of the commentariat, if you will, the mainstream or high-powered people who forecast elections, who work for political parties, that is, the people who plan these things, who run these campaigns, apparently don't know what they're doing. When public data is able to get much better results than they can get with the public data and internal data, that's quite embarrassing. And this leads to a lot of people really misinterpreting and giving really bad advice. You'll see advice from left-wingers saying, like, aha, Polyev should be kicked out. Or you'll see right-wingers say that, aha, it's just this or that, or whatever. Or people say, aha, the Conservatives could have won the election if they focused on Trump earlier, or they could have won the election if they didn't focus on Trump. There's all sorts of discussions. There's all sorts of points and discussion, or arguments being made. But at the end of the day, a lot of these arguments and a lot of these points are basically full of it. Because a lot of the people who are making these points in public are the same internal advisors for the Liberal Party, for the Conservative Party, for the NDP, who systemically, wildly miss the seat counts. The NDP was some of their internal advisors. I don't have the news articles for this, but they were noted as being shocked the election was as close as it was. And in other words, that they lost as many seats as they did. They were shocked by that. The NDP was shocked by that. But then you have people like myself, and I have been saying the NDP's been in a really bad strait for over a year. Over a year, and they get 6 seats. Sorry, 7 seats. They get 7 seats. And if we revise ourselves here and remind ourselves of my map, we will see I had them at 6 seats. I actually overestimated how many votes the NDP were going to get by almost 14%. 1 percentage point, specifically, but a 1.14 times multiplier overestimation on my end for the NDP in number of seats. It turns out that this riding here, can't think of the name off the top of my head, is that Cowichan? I don't know, it doesn't really matter. Turns out that one was a very narrow hold by the NDP incumbent. And it turns out some of the other ridings elsewhere in the country are slightly wrong. But anyways, this just turns out into a shocking affair. And it's quite remarkable in how shocking it is. If all of these people who are paid handsomely, who are well compensated, who have long stretches in time in office, who do this thing professionally, are consistently this bad, you really had to sit there and think that these people don't know what they're talking about. So, before I keep regarding myself, what do I think what this means, what this election happened, what's going on, why are we discussing it in any great detail? Well, the gist, I think the Conservatives could have won. However, it was a very narrow path to victory in hindsight. Courtney Alberni, thank you, David Banks. I always there's 343 ridings. It's so hard to remember which one is which sometimes. Where was I? Yes, so the path to the Conservatives to win in this election, there was 3 things that they really needed to do, and they didn't do any of them. The first one, and now this is a more long-term thing. This is a thing that they should have been setting up much in advance, is they should have been selecting better candidates and better planning so that the local candidates would be given the leeway and freedom to go talk on talk radio, do interviews with local news agencies, etc., do puff pieces in the newspapers of local towns. Now, a lot of conservative advisors and insiders say, and I don't think they're wrong when they say this, that they didn't lose a single vote by not doing those things. And I think that is correct. They didn't lose a vote. There's no one who was voting Conservative prior to the election, or open to voting Conservative prior to the election, who did not vote Conservative because the candidate did not do these local journalist puff pieces. Or go to these local candidate debates or whatever. But by not doing these things, it threw away the opportunity to reach out and talk to a very significant, very large demographic of voters, that being boomers and other retirees, which most retirees at this point are boomers. Soon they'll not be, but for now, they're boomers. And they turned out en masse. They had 80-90% turnout in a lot of precincts. I would potentially argue that every retiree in Canada who was physically and mentally capable of voting might have voted. Especially where I live in Atlantic Canada, that is almost certainly true. I suspect if you were to look into it, the majority of the registered seniors who did not vote were either in nursing homes, were invalids because of healthcare reasons, temporarily or permanently, or for whatever reason they just could not physically get to the ballot box. Those are the people who likely didn't vote in the senior generation, the boomers and such. And not going into these debates, not going into the local media, definitely hurt them. So that's one. I think that's the biggest one. But the second one is campaign focus. Now, I've always been of the opinion that you should indulge in quote-unquote controversial campaign positions. Now, when I say controversial, I don't mean just pick something that's going to cause a stink. You want to pick something that you can defend, you want to defend, that you believe in, etc., 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 etc. And then you need to run on it hard. And you need to talk about it. And the thing you want to talk about is something that is going to provoke everyone else to talk about it. Now, the Conservatives had issues like that. The proposal to use Section 33 on crime and drug-related things was that style of policy, but they waited far too long to announce it. It should have been a much earlier announcement and a much bigger part of the campaign. And a lot of the smaller, more bean counter things, like the small changes to regulations and tax cuts, those are not necessarily bad policies, but they should have been focused on less, because they're just not interesting. They don't get people talking about your campaign. And one of the things the Conservatives really struggled in here with this election was oxygen. Trump was sucking a lot of oxygen out of the air. And the third thing they could have done better, and it's something they could not have done better by the time it had happened, but they had attacked Trudeau too much. And by the time Trudeau is forced out of the Liberal Party and Carney takes over, the Liberals are able to do a clean slate and wipe away all of the issues the voters had on them. And this turned out into a very lost opportunity for the Conservatives, because the issue was never with one particular person. It was the policies the government had run, not the personality of Justin Trudeau. And they really failed on that regard. But elections are not just the case study of what did you do wrong. They are also the case of what the other guy did right. And in the case of the Liberals, they ran their campaign pretty lockstep. Carney used his power as Prime Minister to time the election very, very, very tightly in a way that really advantaged his party. Getting it so that the early voting turnout fell on Easter weekend was a brilliant strategy move from Carney, because it meant that, assuming Trump didn't quiet down, which he didn't, by that point, it would be a great moment to harness and push out a lot of these anxious voters who did not like Trump's threats and overt aggression towards Canada. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. If you were to go look through all the ridings in the country, I haven't done all the math yet because Elections Canada hasn't published the data yet. But I will eventually, I hope. Unless they take too long to publish it and it's no longer relevant. People don't care anymore. But I digress. On election day ballots, I believe the Conservatives either won or nearly won a majority. However, on early voting, the Liberals crushed it. Now, this is not a case of conspiracy theories from Trump or whatever, where the Liberals packed the ballot boxes. Because first off, I will just say in regards to the Canadian election system, Elections Canada holds runs all the elections provincially. It's in the U.S. each state does the election independently, and Elections Canada always holds keeps custody of the ballots that are cast early. So the only way in Canada that you're going to see notable or significant or consequential fraudulent action on elections is if Elections Canada itself is doing that. And if you're in a situation where Elections Canada itself is willingly subverting the election, there's no point in whining anymore because the elections are not real. So it's not really worth discussing. To be clear, I don't believe this happened. I don't believe there's any tomfoolery. I think it was above and board clean. But even if it wasn't, there's no point in discussing it because it's pointless. But that said, you do look at the people who voted, and it makes perfect sense how the Liberals won such a large plurality on early votes. I think they got something like 47% is the estimate of the early vote. And it's because the early vote was overwhelmingly retirees on Easter weekend during the height of the tariff concerns and the rhetoric from Trump. That was the height of that, and that is when they voted. And they voted en masse. There were lines in ballot stations across the province, across the country. So that's the first thing the Liberals did really well. They timed it well. They executed it properly. The other thing the Liberals did very well is Carney. Carney has a very unique appeal, a very strong appeal to the type of voter who voted Liberal. He represents kind of like this old style Canada. I did a whole video on this. If you want to see more detailed argument about that, you'll see that video. But I'll just summarize. He was the right guy for the job for the Liberals. He appealed exactly to the people they needed to win, and they got them. And he did everything necessary to do that. A lot of conservatives you'll see online, or people who are just anti-liberal, will bubble around and say, oh, well, he's so long-winded or mealy-mouthed in his answers or blah, 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 blah. That's on purpose. That is intentional. That is a strategy that appeals very deeply to the type of voter that he wanted to win. Carney would not be doing that because that's just a bad strategy. Now, to a certain extent, you can't just LARP as another person. You have to be yourself. And to an extent, that is how Carney is authentically. That is authentically Carney. But it's not just the case of Carney being that guy. It also is the correct strategy. And I suspect if Carney was the wrong kind of guy for the moment, the Liberals would not have selected him. The thing you need to understand about the Liberal Party of Canada is that their internal leadership races are mostly fiction. And that's not necessarily because the ballots in them are stuffed or whatever, but the leadership rules and timing and everything is groomed in such a way that the preferred guy wins. Almost always. And if there's any dispute, it's usually because the Liberal grandees are uncertain on who the best guy is. But if the Liberal grandees have decided on somebody, that guy almost always wins. I can't remember the last time off the top of my head, so I'm not going to say it never happens, but it's been a very... If it has happened where the Liberal grandees' preferred person lost, it's been a very long time. And I'll just finish up this section with the NDP. I think the NDP's dead. Now, the NDP is not just dead because it lost party status or it lost all these seats. It also is in a very bad position because, and very, 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 very clearly, because of how the election went. Not just who won or how many seats won, but what actually happened. And what do I mean by that? Like, that's kind of a ambiguous statement, isn't it? What actually happened? What actually happened, right? So I'm just going to read off some key endorsements for the Conservative Party. So we have the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers. Now, I will note, that is a very, very big union. It sounds very specific, but it's a very, very big union. The source I'm looking at has removed some of the people that endorse them. But anyways, the gist I was going to make is a whole bunch of unions, including the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, the whole organization. A lot of union locals like United Steelworkers 2251, and some of the IBEW locals like as well. But a whole bunch of manufacturing and trades unions endorsed the Conservatives for the first time ever. A lot of members and a lot of leadership of these unions, even if the local or the whole organization itself did not endorse the Conservatives, the members themselves voted Conservative. Not just the rank and file, not just the blue-collar guys, but the leadership voted Conservative for the first time. And this is quite catastrophic for the NDP, because for a political party to work, you need three things. First, you need a charismatic leader. Now, if you already have a very established party, you can get away with a lackluster leader. If you already have a very robust, strong organization. But if you are a smaller party like the NDP, you need a charismatic leader. You need people who are willing to fund you. And you need people to believe that there's paths to power by supporting you. And that's the tricky one. People have to believe the NDP is a path to power. And that doesn't just mean like, the NDP will form government, but it means that NDP MPs will be on committees. NDP MPs will hold balance of power in Parliament and be able to extract concessions. NDP MPs will be able to pay staffers. Like, one of the big issues that NDP has right now, and I was talking to some political contacts of mine recently, and they're suggesting that NDP might be really willing to do a short election because of this, is the NDP had 25 MPs, now they have 7. Each of those MPs has many, many staffers who are paid by the Parliament budget, the allowances to MPs. And those are gone. The party itself had staffers that were paid for with official party status funding. Gone. Lots of EDAs across the country for the NDP did not get their rebates. Now, EDAs don't usually pay their volunteers, but that means that those EDAs who get no refund because they fail to meet the minimal status are going to be completely broke. So there's really nowhere to go. They might as well try. That's what I've heard people argue. But these are compounding reasons that make it very difficult to sustain a party. If the NDP can rebound in a short order, in a short time, maybe. But it's a ticking time bomb. The longer they go with 7 seats or fewer seats, or the longer they lose and attrit these staffers, the harder it is to attract new ones. The people who are already the NDP core staffer manpower pool, the core volunteer manpower pool, they'll probably stay on. But if there is no path to influence, if there is no ability to backstop someone's efforts and contributions with payment, or no possibility to say, hey, look, we might win, and when we win, you get a 6-figure job as my campaign manager or as my chief of staff. If that opportunity evaporates, you're going to see a lot of people leave the party. Now, the party itself might limp on, like the Green Party does, as a basically cult of personality party, or it could just completely dissolve entirely. It's hard to say, but it's not a good state for the NDP. And with that, we are going to go on to the next little phase. We're going to start talking about Q&As. Is it this one I want to do? No, it's this one. Again, apologies, I have not done this in a bit. No. I think I need this one. Oh, small. Okay, here we go. First Q&A question from Prez Alex Witt. In your opinion, which Canadian political parties, federal or provincial, are most similar, share the largest voter base of the Republican or Democratic parties of the United States? What would you consider to be the largest difference between those political parties and the Republican Democratic Party? So, for all the provinces of Canada, the easiest answer is the Liberal Party of Canada, in most circumstances, would be the more centrist wing of the Democratic Party. Now, the centrist wing of the Democratic Party is probably the largest wing of the Democratic Party. I would say it's probably in the realm of like 40 to 60% of the base, depending on how you want to break things down internally. But the Liberals would be most similar to that. Some states, the Democratic Party and the Liberal Party might be almost identical. The NDP and Greens across the country, for the most part, would be the more left-wing side of the Democrat base for the most part, but they would also be the more union labor side, so they'd be kind of the out there part of the Democratic base that's kind of attriting and going away, which is like in the Rust Belt with the unionized workers there and the blue-collar workers there who are going Republican increasingly. Now, in Western Canada, the NDP there, such as the NDP in BC or Alberta, is probably almost one-to-one how the Democrats would do in those states. In other words, I suspect almost everyone in BC who votes per David Eby would also vote for the Democrat candidate. Now, the Greens in BC throw a bit of a wrinkle because that could all be subsumed into like the general Democrat umbrella, or it could kind of just be a weird splinter movement, or they just might not vote. So it's kind of hard to place that. On the other side of the spectrum, most of the provincial Conservative parties outside of Quebec and the federal Conservative Party would probably vote Republican if they were part of the U.S. Now, I want to really emphasize this. There's a big difference between wanting to vote, or sorry, if they were in the US voting for that party and people supporting joining the US, those are not the same. I'm doing a poll on this. And speaking of, this is a good time to highlight and shout out to people. I am running a poll right now on the Canadian election. Well, not Canadian election, sorry. On a independent separatist sentiment. I mean, I guess the Canadian election and stuff. So if you guys want to participate in my poll, I will just toss up the link in chat real quick. More the merrier. Make sure you share it to your friends and family. Like, it doesn't matter who gets it. 1 second here. Sometimes Google is weird. Okay, here we go. How does this work? I'm still not 100% used to the streaming thing here. We'll just plop it in chat. Let's do that. Okay, apparently Google gave me a bad link. Don't click that. Okay. Trying this again. Here we go. Okay, now we're going to go back to the rest of the content of what I was just talking about here. But I will just digress for a second on the rest of this question because Noble in chat made a very good point. Wouldn't a lot of the Greens in Canada just vote for Jill Stein? A lot of them probably would. But the thing you have to know about the US is ballot access is not universal. So a lot of them might not have the opportunity to vote for Jill Stein. So they might not vote for her. But the 1 to 1.5% or so of the population who just voted Green in 2025 in Canada likely would be voting Jill Stein instead of Democrat. But on the provincial level, like in BC, where they're getting like 10-15%, that might be subsumed into the Democrats for the most part, as opposed to voting for a Green splinter. But it could manifest into a Green splinter. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just unlikely in my mind. Now, regarding back to the question here, the reason why I think most of the Canadian conservative voters would end up voting Republican. Now, this presupposes like voluntary, happy unification or whatever. Is if you look at, say, Nova Scotia, where I'm from, the PC party of Nova Scotia is generally considered a more centrist party. And the Conservative Party of Canada is generally considered more center-right to right-wing. However, there's like a 90% overlap in voter pool. It might even be higher than 90%. It could be 95%. There's very few people who vote Conservative and don't vote PC, or vice versa. And if you look at the volunteer and organizing side, you look at the average PC EDA or the average Conservative Party of Canada EDA, they almost have the same people on them. The same people go to the conferences. The same people go to the policy meetings, whatever. The overlap's almost 100%. And the reason for that is pretty simple. They don't like the policies of the Liberals or the NDP, so they all vote some flavor of PC or Conservative, depending on which level it is. So if you were to replace that with the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, a lot of these people are going to look at the Democrat Party and see, hey, they have very similar policies to the Liberals and the NDP. I don't like those policies. And they will probably end up voting Republican. Some of them might leave the electorate if they think the Republicans are too extreme. Because the Republicans are, generally speaking, to the right of the Canadian Conservatives. In most regards. In some regards, they're not. But generally speaking, you can safely say they're to the right of the Canadian Conservative Party. So some of the more centrist people might leave the electorate, which would be expected because we get somewhere 60 to 70% turnout, and the US typically gets like 45 to 60% turnout. So our turnout's significantly higher. So we would expect if we break down into the U.S. system, the turnout will be lower. But I digress. Quebec would be really complicated. To be honest, I don't think Quebec would ever break into a two-party political system. The minimum, you might get three parties in Quebec. You might get a Republican Party. You might get a Democratic Party. But you will always have either like the CAQ or like the Parti Québécois or some equivalent. Because if you think Quebecers are unhappy being in like 25% of an Anglophone country, imagine how unhappy they're going to be when they are like 3%. They're going to be a very ignored minority in that regard. In fact, I believe they'll be like a couple orders of magnitude fewer than the Mexicans. So, I think they'll be very unhappy about this state of affairs. So I honestly think they might be voting. It might just be a two-party system of the America Party versus like the Parti Québécois, which is kind of what happened in Quebec prior to like the 2000s when the party system got all complicated with like 5 different parties. That said, let's move on to the next question. This is from a combination. It's from Iron Guy GM6VF and Connorminikinus. I don't know. If you had nothing to post, I'd be interested in the same format of a 40-minute video, but a breakdown of an historical election like Diefenbaker or John A., etc. I have considered this before. However, this is a non-trivial thing to do in my format because I can, in principle, plug in polling data from back whenever, do a few things, and get an election result. However, getting polling data for past elections, quite difficult. Getting maps for them and like proper results and demographic data profiles, that's quite difficult. So I'm not saying I won't do it, but that's a non-trivial task. And I'm just not entirely sure if there is enough of a market for people to watch me like break down in my normal format the like 1963 election. Maybe, I don't know. If you really care about that, comment below or in chat. I don't know. But with that, next question. This is from Steven Damroutowski. Apologies if I pronounced your name wrong. I apologize if this question has been asked already, but in your opinion, who is/was your favorite leader for each of the 3 major Canadian parties? Liberals, Conservatives, and the New Democrats. So, this is an interesting question. Not necessarily because of the question itself, more so, I don't really like most Canadian politicians. If I were to go with the first pass, there's a couple ways to answer this question. We're going to go with pass 1 here. So pass 1 here is people who have been prime minister. And I do this limitation because it's a lot easier. I would say my favorite liberal prime minister probably was like Paul Martin. Fairly unoffensive. For the Conservatives, my favorite Conservative prime minister, this is like, I feel like this is not that controversial, but probably was like Sir John A. Macdonald. The NDP haven't had a prime minister, so scratch that. We now expand out to people who were not prime ministers, but were party leaders. For the Conservatives, probably Scheer was the, off the top of my head, Scheer's probably the best conservative who did not. I'm not counting Poilievre because he's still technically the leader of the party and still running, but we exclude Poilievre. I'd say Scheer's probably my favorite conservative leader. That's a pretty low bar. Again, I have a very low opinion of most political leaders in Canada. For the Liberals, probably. Oh, this is tough. This is a tricky one. I really do not like many many Canadian leaders. So, I think I'm gonna go with John Turner. It's kind of a wild card. My rationale behind John Turner is I think he was right on trade integration with the U.S. being bad. The degree we did. I mean, we're seeing the aftermath right now where one U.S. president can be flamboyant and angry about trade and suddenly can risk our entire economy. And also, I really don't like Mulroney, so he kind of gets negatively polarized into the positive category. For the NDP, I'm going to be lame and say Jack Layton. I don't necessarily think Jack Layton would have been a good prime minister, but the NDP bench is pretty bad. If I knew more about him, I might be more favorable to Tommy Douglas, but I just don't really know enough about him to really want to stick a claim to it. But ones in living memory for me, Jack Layton. More from vibes, but than anything else. Like, I don't think I'd ever voted for Jack Layton. Then we have another question from Prez Alex Witt. Have you found an American equivalent for the ideological distribution of Canadians chart from Abacus data? How successful would you say are economic progressive / cultural conservative politicians? Are there any historical or contemporary politicians / political parties that fit into that group? So, we're gonna do this back to front. So there are historical / contemporary politicians that fall into that group, but it's kind of esoteric. It really depends on how you want to classify it. But to just start throwing some ones that exist, like you could say the Danish Social Democratic Party is culturally conservative, economically progressive. You could say Slovakia Smer is. The BSW in Germany, you could say fits that category. You could say Marine Le Pen's party, National Rally, fits into that category. You could say the Parti Québécois fits into that category. You could go on. There's parties that fit in this category, especially today. I would say, Canadian-wise, ignoring Parti Québécois, you could vaguely say the Socreds are kind of like that, though it's kind of hard to lump them all together because the Socreds were really changed significantly based on the leader at the time. On question 2, how successful would you say are economic progressive / cultural conservative politicians? Usually, these politicians are not very successful, but I don't think it's because of the ideology they're espousing. I think it's really just because they're bad politicians. So the thing that's really key to know about politicians and really key to know about what makes someone good or bad or whatever, how do I want to put this? Most politicians do not get their job by merit. And that's not to say there's some conspiracy or whatever, but what makes you a good politician is not strictly skills that you get by being just good or just bad. They are skills that you kind of generate over time, and they're mostly connection skills. So basically, the people who take over the Conservative Party of Canada, for example, let's say Poilievre gets knifed and they're going to have a new election. The guy who wins the next leader of the Conservative Party of Canada is not going to be the person who's most likely to win the election, the general. It's going to be the guy who's most able to convince the base that he is a quote-unquote blue Tory. And it's not just the grassroots and the lay voters. It's also the donors. It's also the caucus. It's also all these other people who matter. So a lot of these politicians who fall into the economic progressive / cultural conservative category, they end up not doing very well because a lot of them are too idealistic in a sense. And then they're too ideological. And no matter how good your ideology is, no matter how good your plans are, you can't be an ideological leader in practice. That's why Justin Trudeau's government fell apart. It's why the Liberal Party normally wins elections in Canada. They're not ideological for the most part. Trudeau lost. Sorry, I phrased it probably. Trudeau was losing and did really bad because he was too ideological. But the Liberals were doing really well, and Carney just won because Carney isn't ideological. He might have books that say things, but when he's in public, when he's saying policies, when he's pitching things, he's not doing this from a politics lens. He's doing it from a pragmatism ends. Sorry, an ideology. He's doing it from pragmatism, not from ideology. Now, ideology might underpin some of the motives where they don't think pragmatism matters. So in other words, if Carney's sitting there and he's making a decision between retaining liberal power or doing ideological thing, he's going to sacrifice ideology. But if he doesn't think this action has any bearing on power, he's going to do the ideological thing. That's what you do when you govern. That's what being in government is for or about. So, a lot of the economic progressive, cultural conservative types are too ideological to understand this, or they're too unwilling to make changes. It's kind of like, in a sense, the inverse of the libertarian type, the economic conservative, cultural liberal type, if you will. Those people also are really awful at winning elections. They're basically unelectable because they're too ideological. They don't want to make sacrifices. They don't want to accept trade-offs. So they almost never succeed at anything, ever. Now, I think there's a lot of movement and momentum on the economic progressive, cultural conservative side. Oh, pardon me for that one. Let me just quench my throat. But, at least in Canada, we don't have many big public figures who fit that umbrella very clearly. And the final question, have you found an American equivalent for the ideology distribution of Canadians chart from Abacus data? There are some scatter plots that float around. And these scatter plots show, like, the ideology of Americans or whatever their preferences. I don't have it off the I have one offhand, but they exist and they float around. And they basically show the exact same thing Abacus shows. And you can see find the same similar data for the UK, and it shows almost the same thing. Almost nobody is economically conservative and socially liberal. Almost no one sits there. It's a very small percentage of the population. More people are economic and social conservatives or social liberal, fiscal liberal, economic liberal, or they are economic liberal, social conservative. Those three groups, 3 out of 4 groups, make up almost all the people. This is why I have made a mostly joking, but not entirely joking, thing, the political triangle. This is the Abacus chart underneath it. I made this because we can adjust how the triangle is exactly shaped. But in practice, there is actually only 3 corners. Like, this corner doesn't exist. No one lives, almost no one is in this corner. So, you really can just view politics as three sides. You have conservatives ish. You have like the liberal conservative ish type people. You have like the socialist adjacent people, and then you have what I would call like social conservative / Toryist group. Those are the three corners that kind of exist. You could say communitarian, individualist, or collectivist, perhaps, but there really isn't this group. And this group here has historically been very poorly led and very poorly organized. So you mostly just have this group, the individualists versus the collectivists, and that's how most of the 21st century has been, and the 20th century has been. There's been very, very few parties in this side, and very few countries in this side. If you were to look at ideologies of 20th century countries, you probably had like Franco somewhere over here. Franco is Spain. Maybe it would have been over here closer. Depends exactly when you want to rate things. The various fascist countries were, again, they're roughly here. Maybe like Italy's like over here, or like Nazi Germany's like down here or something. It doesn't really matter. They're roughly around here. All the socialist countries are over here. The Western liberal capitalist countries, they're all somewhere in this yellow triangle, pretty much. Modern day, we have some movement from yellow into this red, or like the bleeding area right here. But again, there's not many examples of countries or parties that have governed here. Some exist, don't get me wrong, but not many. I have one question here in chat. But if you have any more questions you want to ask before I finish off stream, make sure you put in the chat before I wrap up here. So, this is from Nick A. Love your work. Enjoy your content. Can you explain the Liberal success in mainland Nova Scotia? So, I'm waiting a little touch to like fully dive in that because I want to see the poll-by-poll results. But the gist here kind of boils down to this will be the easiest way to show it. Now, this is not going to have the up-to-date one because the up-to-date data doesn't exist. But let's take the case study here. South Shore, St. Margaret's. Now, a lot of this peninsula here, Chebucto Peninsula, that's gone. So it's like, basically this is the writing, right? What I suspect happened is the Conservatives, Rick Perkins, did really well in Shelburne and Queens County. But Lunenburg County did really well for the sorry, I'm just laughing at the comment in chat. The Lunenburg County, I think, went really, really liberal. And the reason why I think Lunenburg County went really liberal is, again, the turnout of these seniors. This Bridgewater, Lunenburg, Chester over here, these 3 towns in Lunenburg County make up a very, very large percentage of the population of Lunenburg County, especially when you count the suburbs of these towns. And these have been retirement communities for basically the entirety of Canada for months, years. So not just Nova Scotian retirees go here, but retirees from Ontario particularly, but also like Alberta or Saskatchewan, they come back to Nova Scotia, or they move to Nova Scotia, and they retire in these communities along Mahone Bay. And they apparently just seemed all voted. The other theory I have right now relates to specifically, say, King's Hants, a little bit to Annapolis, Acadianapolis, and a little bit to Cumberland Colchester, is that Cody Blois, despite the fact that he's not a very likable person in many ways, the farmers in Nova Scotia really like Cody Blois, at least in King's Hands. And him temporarily being promoted to the ag minister, I think actually got a lot of these people to vote Liberal again, thinking that the guy they like and the guy that their local dude that they like and has been representing them for a while is going to stay on as ag minister, and then Cody got immediately sacked as ag minister again. So some of these areas might flip back pretty quickly in the next election, but I suspect why Acadianapolis was so close is Annapolis County had very high turnout of farmers. And again, places like Annapolis County, places like Kings, places like Amherst and Truro. Again, a lot of people are retiring to those areas from the rest of Canada, and I think that is also impacting it. I'm a little less informed on the specifics of Pictou. I guess you could say Central Nova, but this is really just Pictou. And Cape Breton. These are technically the old boundaries, by the way, but that doesn't really matter. A little less informed on those ones, but I think it's basically the same story. A lot of retirees came in over the last couple of years, and they settled in a lot of retirement communities around the province. And they got activated really heavily by these events, and the Liberals made a few tactical decisions that really boosted their credibility with some key voters. Because the thing that's really important to note here with the Nova Scotian results in 2025 is the Liberals got 330,000 odd votes. The Conservatives got 200,000. Now, you might not be that familiar with how these things work, but 200,000 votes for the Conservatives in Nova Scotia is stupendously high. Let me just bring this back up over here. Okay. Okay, we're going to move my son over here. Whoop, whoop, whoop. I'm going to have a full video breaking down stuff from the spreadsheet here, but here we can see how the Liberals did election over election in Nova Scotia. And here we can see what the Conservatives did, the NDP did, the Greens did, etc. And here was my estimate for what the 2025 election was going to be. And this, if you remember back, this is the data I used to make my projection for the on the video about do provincial elections predict federal results. That's what I based this on. So this is the numbers I based things on. And you can see here, the Liberals did way better than expected. But notably, the Conservatives did as well. They got 24,000 more votes than forecasted by me. So a lot of what happened here in Nova Scotia isn't just the Conservatives did good or the Conservatives did bad or whatever. Or the Liberals did good or whatever. It's the province has basically, a lot of the country has broken down into two-party races. So the Liberals in 21 had 207,000 votes, and the NDP had about 108,000, and the Greens had about 9,000. Collectively, they had 324,000. Okay? Simple math. Quick math. Those three parties in this election had 367,000. So 40,000 people, more people, voted for the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens in 2025 than they did in 2021. But as opposed to 2021, where this broke down like 2/3 voted Liberals and then 1/3 voted everyone else, this broke down into almost everyone voted Liberal and almost no one voted other people, the other two. It was like 90% voted Liberal of those three parties. The Conservatives, pardon me, gained 50,000 voters. They didn't just gain the PPC too. No, they did cannibalize most of the PPC. They probably took about 14,000 votes from the PPC. They didn't just do that, though. They didn't just take 14,000. They gained a lot of new voters. They probably flipped some Liberals, too. Flipped some Dippers as well. So, yes, the Liberals did really well in Nova Scotia. But this was kind of an anomalous, kind of a weird election. So, there's that. But we seem to have no other questions here, so I'm going to wrap up momentarily. But I'm just going to wrap up and say I'm going to experiment with potentially slightly more complicated videos, but fewer over the next 2-3 months. So let me know on what your thoughts are on this news change. So I'm going to probably do like 2 weeks per video now instead of 1 week per video. Unless something pops up like an election or something like that, then I'll go back to weekly uploads. But as it is, there's just really not much to talk about in Canadian politics. And I figure doing a more complicated, more detailed video as opposed to weekly slog when there's nothing to say is a better use of your time. And my time. I have a son. I'd much rather spend time with my son. But I don't want to kill my YouTube channel because I just had a baby. That's, like, silly. I want to build something here. So, we're gonna change this upload schedule slightly. Let me know how you feel about all that in the comments below. And, I hope you guys all have a good day. And look at this. Look at this little guy. Aww. My son. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. With that, I bid you guys all adieu, and I will see you hopefully Monday with an actual video. But with that, bye.